Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivas Hari Gaur Bhaktivinoda. It's time for Krishna book. This is Volume 2, Chapter 32, and this will be Part 10. It's a very long chapter. It's the prayers of the Vedas personified. And this is the summary study of the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, translated and presented in storybook form by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, and founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. So this is a continuation. This is Part 10. The personified Vedas therefore concluded, O Lord, both you and the limited dhruvas, the living entities, are eternal. The form of the unlimited eternal is sometimes calculated as the universal form, and in the Vedic literatures like the Upanishads, the form of the limited eternal is vividly described. It said therein that the original spiritual form of the living entity is 1/10,000th the size of the tip of a hair. It stated that the spirit is greater than the greatest and smaller than the smallest. The individual living entities who are eternally part and parcel of God are smaller than the smallest. With our material senses, we can perceive neither the Supreme, who is greater than the greatest, nor the individual soul, who is smaller than the smallest. We have to understand both the greatest and the smallest from the authoritative sources of Vedic literature. Vedic literature states that the supersoul is sitting within the heart of a living entity and is as big as a thumb. Therefore, the argument may be put forward, how can something the size of a thumb be accommodated within the heart of an ant? The answer is that this thumb measurement of the supersoul is imagined in proportion to the body of the living entity. In all circumstances, therefore, the supersoul and the individual living entity cannot be taken as one, although both of them enter within the material body of a living entity. The supersoul living within the heart is for directing or controlling the individual living entity, although both are dhruva, or eternal. The living entity is always under the direction of the Supreme. It may be argued that because the living entities are born of the material nature, they are equal and independent. In the Vedic literature, however, it is said that the Supreme Personality of Godhead impregnates the material nature with the living entities, and then they come out. Therefore, the appearance of the individual living entities is not factually due to material nature alone, just as a child produced by a woman is not her independent production. A woman is first impregnated by a man, and then a child is produced. As such, the child produced by the woman is part and parcel of the man. Similarly, the living entities are apparently produced by the material nature, but not independently. It is due to the impregnation of material nature by the Supreme Father that the living entities are present. Therefore, the argument that the individual living entities are not part and parcel of the Supreme cannot stand. For example, the different parts and parcels of the body cannot be taken as equal to the whole. Rather, the whole body is the controller of the different limbs. Similarly, the parts and parcels of the Supreme Whole are always dependent and are always controlled by the source of the parts and parcels. It is confirmed in Bhagavad-gītā that the living entities are part and parcel of Krishna, Mama Evamsa. No sane man, therefore, will accept the theory that the supersoul and the individual soul are of the same category. They are equal in quality, but quantitatively the supersoul is always the supreme, and the individual soul is always subordinate to the supersoul. That's the conclusion of the Vedas. Two significant words used in this connection are Yanmaya and Chinmaya. In Sanskrit grammar, the word Maya is used in the sense of transformation and also in the sense of sufficiency. The Mayavad philosophers interpret that Yanmaya or Chinmaya indicates that the living entity is always equal to the Supreme. But one has to consider whether this affix Maya is used for sufficiency or for transformation. The living entity never possesses anything exactly in the same proportion as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, this Maya affixed cannot be used to mean that the individual living entity is self-sufficient. The individual living entity never has sufficient knowledge. Otherwise, how could he have come under the control of Maya or the material energy? The word sufficient can be accepted, therefore, only in proportion to the magnitude of the living entity. The spiritual oneness of the Supreme Lord and the living entities is never to be accepted as homogeneous. Each and every living entity is individual. If homogeneous oneness is accepted, then by the liberation of one individual soul, all other individual souls would have been liberated immediately. But the fact is that every individual soul is differently enjoying and suffering in the material world. The word mayat is also used in the sense of transformation, or sometimes it is also used to mean byproduct. The impersonalist theory is that Brahman himself has accepted different types of bodies, and that this is his lila or pastime. There are, however, many hundreds and thousands of species of life in different standards of living conditions, such as human beings, demigods, animals, birds, and beasts, and all of them were expansions of the Supreme Absolute Truth. Then there would be no question of liberation from Brahman, who is already liberated. Then there would be no question of liberation because Brahman is already liberated. Another interpretation put forward by the Mayavadis is that in every millennium, different types of bodies are manifested, and when the millennium is closed, all the different bodies or expansions of Brahman automatically become one, ending all different manifestations. Then, in the next millennium, according to this theory, Brahman again expands in different bodily forms. If we accept this theory, then Brahman becomes subject to change. But this cannot be accepted. From Vedanta Sutra, we understand that Brahman is by nature joyful. He cannot therefore change himself into a body which is subject to painful conditions. Actually, living entities who are part and parcel of Brahman are infinitesimal particles prone to be covered by the illusory energy. As explained before, the particles of Brahman are like sparks blissfully dancing within a fire. But there is a chance of their falling from the fire to the smoke, although smoke is another condition of fire. This material world is just like smoke, and the living entity and the spiritual world is just like a blazing fire. The innumerable living entities are prone to fall down to the material world from the spiritual world when influenced by illusory energy. And it is also possible for the living entity to become liberated again when, by cultivation of real knowledge, he becomes completely freed from the contamination of the material world.